opinions in this room. How extraordinary. All right, well, we'll see as we go along. All right. Okay, so we talked before about ways to assess these revolutionary claims. We want to know, well, what actually happened. We want to know who was involved. And then these questions about what came before and what after. That is, are there certain things we're attributing to the revolution which really happened before and therefore can't be attributed? And what are the things that came after which we can at least start to think of as effects? And then the question of what happened elsewhere. Is it going to be the same wherever this machine lands up? And from that, what was necessary, sufficient, etc., etc. So let's have a look at some of those. So the basic notion, which you didn't really get from Eisenstein, of what happened, what really began. So let me, in a slide, try to give you the technology of the revolution. What Gutenberg is claimed to have done, and he was a metal worker, possibly a son of a gold worker, his biography is little known, is invented away this thing called a punch. That is, you take a solid piece of metal, like that, and you carve out of the tip the letter that you want. Excuse me, my drawing isn't very good. So you carve away at the sides here until you have something where the letter stands up proud on top, like that. And so that's the punch. So now your letter is sort of sticking out of the top. And you take that along, and that's in hard metal, you take that to a softer piece of metal, which is usually called the matrix. I should be doing this upside down. And you thump it into it with a hammer, so it makes a soft impression. And now you have a negative image of the letter. So when you have, after doing this punch, now I'm not really going to be able to draw this, a kind of negative hollow, better seen up there, then you can come along and build what's called a matrix on top, a little box, into which you pour your lead or antimony, and you end up with a piece that again looks like this, but now made of softer metal. So that's the process. You make a punch in hard metal, you punch into the matrix, and then you pour lead into it, so you go from a positive image to a negative image, back to a positive image, so you end up with a piece that looks roughly like that. Sort of understand, despite my inept drawing, the process? Okay, so that's what Gutenberg is really claimed to do. If you wanted to carve every letter in order to write the Bible, you'd just be carving until the end of time. So what you do instead is you just carve the letter H, and then you can make 1,000 H's, 2,000 H's. So that's the great, or M's, or whatever. So that's the great advantage of doing it this way. That was the great insight. Instead of carving in wood and doing it once only, you carved in metal and started to make these images. You stored them conventionally, as you see, there are lots of pictures in here. I'll leave this on the desk as you're leaving if you want to look. Moxon will talk about him next time. You store them in a type tray like this, so you can see you have your capital letters and your lowercase letters. In fact, often these were kept in separate drawers, and that's why we still refer to upper and lower case, because the capital letters were kept in one case, and the small letters were kept in the lowercase. So one was uppercase and one was the lowercase. They are, when you see them in a tray like this, in an odd arrangement, can anyone suggest why the typecase looks like that and doesn't just all look entirely like the capital letters up there? Yes. The frequency of the letters that were used, exactly. These are much more frequent letters. So when you do typesetting, and I began at 13 or 14, you kind of learn the case, and you know these ones most familiarly, and those ones you barely know at all. Anyone know why that was important? This is an image from the 17th century, so already by then the frequency was known and understood. Well, it's actually what led to Morse code. How did they decide what had the shortest number of dots and dashes? Well, they looked at the typecase and decided, well, look, let's give these ones the shortest because we're going to be using those most often. And I find there was a nice story about a guy at the Oxford University Press setting type in Greek. And what you do to set type, you can kind of see up there, you take this form in your hand, and you put the letters in one by one. You're writing backwards, but here he's spelling out Helvetica. You put out the H, and then the E, and then the L, and then the V. And you go along, you do a line, or maybe two lines, and you put it more and more into the large pattern here, which is going to be what you print from. He was setting in Greek, another typesetters at the Oxford University Press knew Greek, and suddenly he called over the head of the compositing room, and he said, there's a mistake in this text here. And the guy said, how do you know? You can't read Greek. He said, I know I can't, but there's a mistake here. Yeah, shut up, you don't know. But he went on complaining, and he summoned down an editor from higher up, and they said, look, you can't speak Greek, you don't know what you're talking about. So finally they got the senior editor of the Greek dictionary, and he came down. He said, well, why are you saying this? Why are you saying this? Well, I've been setting type for 35 years, and I've never made a movement from there to there in my life. So I think there's something wrong. And the guy looked at the text, he said, you're right, there is something wrong here, and they made a correction. So it's this deep embodied knowledge of the typeface which people get in typing and printing. So you then make it up into a form like this, you lock it in the chase so the type won't move, and you stick it in the middle of the machine, running over the top, press paper down on it, wind it down tight so it gets a full impression, and you pull it off. And there you have the essence of Gutenbergian printing. You get the type, you get the stored large amounts of type, you start to make it up, and then when you have finished with that, you can break up the type, it's called, or disk the type, as it's sometimes called, back, so you can use it again and again. And that's the advantage of having type like this, is that you can keep reusing it again and again. So that's Gutenberg in an essence. And it had a remarkable effect in that it very quickly spread from Mainz in the center of Germany all around Europe. And that's one of the ways we know this was important technology, is the speed with which for the time it spread. 10 years it was in Italy, in 15 years it was already in France, all over Italy, heading towards those rather slower people in London. But it was getting out and about, and people were picking up very quickly, and particularly in northern Italy, where around Venice and beyond became the centers of printing rather than Germany in many ways. Now, it is a remarkable story, it's one that Eisenstein tells, but anyone notice anything slightly odd about the map that we're looking at there? Well, when it leaves Germany, what are the countries it goes to? Sorry? The Mediterranean countries. Now, what's the first thing that Eisenstein sees as the output of the first revolution that he sees? There are three. The science, there's the Renaissance, or perhaps more important and more immediate, the Reformation. And where did the Reformation happen? Well, it didn't happen in northern Italy. And it didn't happen in the center of France. It did happen to some extent in Germany, clearly. So again, our claims of what printing will do versus where printing went have to be modified by that. Okay, so next question, who was involved? All right, well, we know the most famous person who was involved is Gutenberg. And there, although in this early drawing he actually looks as if he's smoking a delicate cigarette, what he actually has in his hand is a type punch, and that's his hair, not smoke, that's coming up from it. But there you can see the punch, the emblematic punch in his hand, and the negative where he's punched letters into soft metal. It's an odd picture. Now, he was a metal worker. It's thought very, very little is known about him from Mainz. There were political troubles in Mainz, and he and his family were probably in exile, where he formed a partnership with some odd characters, Riff and Pritzheim and Hellman. And again, very little is known about this until in 1438, one of them died. And as a result of that, there was a lawsuit. And that's all we really know of these early days, is the things that were revealed in the lawsuit. And one of the things that were revealed is an odd letter in which Dritzhn says there are 4 pieces that must be destroyed. This is kind of an industrial secret that he doesn't want to get out. He and his cronies know, and if anybody else comes in and looks at his tape and finds these things, the secret will be out. That's the hunch, that these are for type punches or pieces of type, and that he doesn't want them to become generally known. In 1439, the remaining partners are involved in a kind of tragic entrepreneurial mishap. There is going to be a pilgrimage to Aachen. And what you wore, different pilgrims would stick different things in your hat. But the Aachen pilgrimage was marked by having a little mirror, which was meant to be your reflection of God in the heavens. And so Gutenberg and his cronies went into business to produce these mirrors, produced a whole lot, and then the pilgrimage was postponed because of the plague. So they had all these mirrors and nowhere to go, so they were bankrupt. And that's part of what the lawsuit comes out of. But finally, Gutenberg himself gets back to Mainz, and he has presumably these 4 pieces. And he finds somebody who's going to fund his startup. This guy, Johannes Fust. He finds a great employee who's been particularly good with type, Schaefer. And he finds an interesting ally in this cardinal, Nicholas of Cusa, who's good and useful in various ways, which I'll get to. So that's the setup. Finally, in the 1840s, actually that should really be, he's back in Mainz, and he's now established a company and a partnership with these people. Now, in fact, the partnership goes sour. Fust decides that he wants control, and the Gutenberg isn't doing a good job, so he sues, he wins, and he gets control of the type, the press, the capability, and Gutenberg again leaves Mainz, and we don't hear much more of him. And then a firm is formed of Fust and Schaefer, and there's some belief that there was something dishonest going on here, and in fact Schaefer and Fust sort of kind of ganged up on Gutenberg, and Gutenberg got chucked out. So here we have, again, as Eisenstein says, we have as Stephen Fry says, we have a kind of Silicon Valley story. We have a startup, one of the inventors gets kicked out, head of Yahoo, gets chucked out by the partners who want the money, and these are in the same place. Okay, so in Gutenberg's time, in fact, remarkably little was actually printed. There are various suggestions, but the first was probably an indulgence, the Cyprus indulgence. The second was the very famous Bible. The third, which he might have worked on, but is usually given to Schoeffer, is the main Psalter. So that more or less is the complete works. We begin with an indulgence, we have the Bible, and we have the Psalter. There's a certain irony in that. Anybody see an irony in this collection? Okay, so back to Eisenstein. So the Great Revolution was the Reformation. The Reformation involved Luther. What was Luther protesting against? Indulgences. And what in fact is the first thing that the printing press produces very efficiently? Indulgences. So the story that the printing press came along and attacked the church is in part true, but the printing press also came along and aided the church. And in fact, the printing of indulgences was extraordinary. So here, towards the, just in 2 years, 200,000 indulgences were printed. So again, we put the printing press on one side, but it's on both sides of this argument. All right, so moving right along. These are Eisenstein's arguments that we get the Renaissance, but then she admits actually the Renaissance was already well underway, and maybe it just changed a bit as the printing press comes along. We get the Reformation, though in there, there's evangelism and capitalism as much as there's technology involved. She isn't saying it's simply the press, and it's the scientific revolution. Now we're going to be talking all about that in the next class, so we'll get back to some of these themes about print and science. But we should just notice for now that there is a problematic time lag that Eisenstein doesn't really address in these claims. Because if you look at the death of Gutenberg, well, Francis Bacon, who's sometimes in the English-speaking word seen as the father of modern science, well, he's almost 100 years later. Galileo, 100 years later. Descartes, 150 years later. Newton getting on to 200 years later. The Royal Society, which as we'll see was famous, as Alice in fact mentioned, for its printed journals, and we'll talk about these, is almost 200 years later. So there's a huge time lag in which it's fairly difficult to say, well, this one technology covers that whole gap and can be accounted. We have to take into account the things that went on in between. And in fact, we will when we discuss in the next class Science and the Scientific Revolution. All right, so what came before? And this is just to remind us that, again, Eisenstein is talking in part about scholarly results that came from printing. And we all know a certain amount because we've already talked a bit about scholarly books when we talked about the Codex. One thing the standard to notice is it's tricky sometimes to see how dramatic the change was. Can anyone tell me which of these three is the printed book? Yes. Sorry? The one on that? You are? Sorry? Cassandra, sorry, I know you told me before. Cassandra says the one on the left. Who's for the one on the left? All right. Any other offers? Yes? The one in the middle, you are? And Nikita. So Cassandra's left one. Anyone going for right? All right, we've got a few rightists here. It's actually the one in the middle, and Nikita wins. But it's pretty hard to tell. And indeed, in some ways, he was imitating what was available. But what's more interesting in some way than that imitation is that some of the stuff that we think of as most important to scholarship, as we discussed last time, had already come about in the manuscript book. And not only that, we talk about Parkes saying, look, the book changed a great deal before printing came along and produced all these things that we talk about, the graphs, the running heads, subdivisions, analytic tables of content, all these things which in a way are the key to the scholarly book, had been developed in the manuscript period. And in fact, as Anne Blair rather unkindly says, about the only innovation that you could attribute to print in the format of the book is the title page. The title page is probably not the most important of all the things. Though it's significant, but early title pages didn't tell you an awful lot. What's interesting in some ways is how difficult it was for the book to deal with what we think of as the scholarly things. So again, Eisenstein thinks you can send this stuff out into the world and scholars can communicate with each other. But in fact, even to have a page number, so you can say, take this book and look at page 13, is problematic, or page 397, because printed books had a lot of trouble producing page numbers. Page numbers were fine in the manuscript period, and here are some nice examples of manuscript ones, some in Roman, some in Arabic noodles. So the manuscript had no trouble doing that and had been doing it for 200 years almost when Gutenberg came along. The print book, however, had great trouble. This is Smith who did a study of it and looked very closely at about 5,000 of these books. Of 4,994 incunables, only 10.3% used printed foliation. Incunable, anybody know the term? An incunable is a printed book, and foliation is not page numbers, but numbers at the beginning of each folio. I talked about a folio before when you take a single sheet and showed it. They began by just putting numbers on the first of the folio. But in fact, probably the first printed foliation, the numbers I've seen for it, about 1480, 1470s to 1480. They were very rare. You can look through 5,000 of them and not find them at all. So these keys to the scholarly work that Eisenstein is describing, print had a lot of trouble producing. And in fact, not only were they bad at producing it, but when they produced them, they were terribly inaccurate. So Eisenstein's story that the book was now this accurate form, this is a Dutch writer saying after examining about 80,000 Dutch books from the 16th, 17th century, printers did not care for page numbers. 60 to 70% contained mistakes in the page numbers. Some 50% of the page numbers were wrong. So again, our idea that we've just got this wonderful new tool for scholars is problematic. And indeed, there's been some very interesting recent work saying that in fact the first page numbers that were produced in fact to help the censors. They were so you could identify pages which had stuff that people shouldn't read and go in and take them out. So it's an odd account, but clearly it wasn't for scholarly reasons or for strange scholarly reasons. All right, so just very quickly going through this. Now we've looked at the question of who was involved, of what came before, but then there's the big question of what happened elsewhere. Because that's a real challenge to any theory of the effects of technology, is if you can say, well, look, this technology turned up somewhere else and didn't have any of these effects, then your story about the effects of technology has a lot of problems. So we start to look away from our obsession with Western Europe and say, well, what's going on in the rest of the world? Well, a lot was going on. I have mentioned that great moment at the beginning of the Chinese Olympics when they took through this model of metal type, as if to remind the rest of the world that Gutenberg isn't really the center of this story. And in fact, people for a long time knew that. It's odd that it kind of becomes forgotten. But if you look at these 16th century books, he, for instance, says whether the Germans first borrowed this invention from the Chinese, apologies to the Chinese, or whether amongst the Germans John Gutenberg or Fust or Margutin was the first inventor of it, matters not. They're sort of edgy. They say, well, it doesn't really matter if the Chinese had it. But it does, because it upsets our story about the importance of Gutenberg. So we need to know a little of what was going on elsewhere. Well, the Chinese had different forms of printing for a very long time. It begins with seals, because seals, of course, are a kind of print form. You print in the soft wax. And then there's a kind of story that one way in which they wanted to preserve sacred texts was they would carve them in stone. And about the 2nd century, people began to say, well, look, now I've got all these raised letters in stone. If I put a bit of ink over the top, I can then put a sheet of paper, which we as the Chinese have just developed, on top, and I get a strange mobile reproduction of what was written in stone. And so that probably begins with the Confucian classics long, long before Gutenberg. And in fact, although that doesn't survive, there are records of Chinese xylography, that is no longer carving in wood, which is lithography, but carving in stone, going back at least to the 8th century or so, 8th or 7th century, and the earliest surviving and still surviving comes from the 9th century. So there's a lot of printing going on. Now, people will tend to say, well, look, that's just xylography, and printing on wood blocks is not all that interesting. Well, it allowed them to do quite a lot. They produced playing cards, they produced printed textiles, they produced paper money, which had an enormous effect when the Europeans learned about it. But they also began to work with movable type. So in about the 11th century, there were clay movable type, which started to look very like, well, it doesn't look very like my bad drawings, but would look like a better drawing of what type looks like. So already, and there are huge centers of printing in China. In the Northern Song, the earlier, there were probably 30, and by the 12th century, there were probably 200 centers of printing. So even that map that we've had of Europe looks fairly tame compared to this. And it spreads outside, it spreads to Japan. There's very strange xylographic production, which was done then known as the Empress's Charms. There were these little pagodas, and inside there was a little printed text, which actually wasn't really meant to be read, it was just there as a kind of religious observance. But some suggestions are that up to 1 million of these were printed. Now, I think there are something like 43 partial extant copies of the Gutenberg Bible, but it doesn't get anywhere near 1 million in terms of its run. But more impressive, perhaps, than the Chinese or the Japanese is what went on in Korea, which had got paper from China and now got printing from China and picked it up and ran with it. So by the 8th century, they were producing xylography on a fairly large format. By the Korea dynasty, which lasts for about 400 years, they developed 3 distinct methods of reproduction, and they all exist side by side. They have transcription, so you have Trithemius all over again. They have xylography, where they produce the sacred texts. And for the civil service and government business, they have typography. And they're capable of doing some fairly remarkable things. The first, and I probably will mispronounce this, Tripitaka of the Buddhist text was produced in the 11th century. But the one that they produced in the 12th century had something like 85,000 wood blocks. And in fact, that's how it's stored, this massive, massive print production. Now, the reasons that they were so important. One is that they began to produce competitive civil service exams, and so people wanted textbooks, and print became a very useful way to circulate that. Another was that the Mongol invasion destroyed almost everything they had, and they had very quickly to reconstitute the state after it. The wooden type was burned, so wood wasn't a good idea. Their archives were burned, they needed to recreate them. And so you see them move from about the 13th century to metal movable type. You see them starting to produce important books in metal movable type that still exist. You see them establish a department of publishing, a department, a type foundry. And then people will say, yeah, but of course the trouble was that they didn't have an alphabet. So they come along and they produce an alphabet as well. So by the time we get to Gutenberg, all this has been around for a very long time. And it perhaps been around elsewhere too. There's an interesting Hebrew manuscript which talks about the first, in Avignon, where someone undertakes to write 27 square Hebrew letters engraved in iron. So it looks as though they're in Avignon. Again, the same time as Gutenberg, someone's experimenting with metal type. So, summed up in a book by Carter, as he wrote in the 20th century on the printing press, he looks back to the 19th century and rather cruelly he says, Theodore Devine in his book, The Invention of Printing, writes, the inventor of printing did not invent paper, did not originate engraving on wood, was not the first to print on paper, he was not the first to make the printed book, it's not certain that he made the first press, and it's not probable that he was the first to think or make movable type. What he did invent was the type mold. And then Carter adds, it was the type mold that the Koreans invented. And suddenly, poor old Gutenberg, everything that's been attributed to him just doesn't seem to be there at all. And in fact, some recent work done down at Stanford by these two, Needham and Glaser-Gerodiakis, is suggesting that possibly the 42-line Bible wasn't set in metal type at all. So Gutenberg's world, sadly for the poor chap, falls apart a bit further. So, some questions then. Well, where did it all come from? Was this coincidence? Was this a case of simultaneous invention? And that's one possibility. These things happen. Though it seems a little odd. There are other stories that Europeans began to notice what was going on in China. So, for instance, Marco Polo, who had been out there, came back and he reported that the Khan causeth the bark of trees to be made into something like paper. So here's where the paper, remember Europe didn't really have much in the way of paper around this time, is now coming back. And then to pass for money all over his country. All the Grand Khan subjects receive this paper money without hesitation, because wherever their business may call them, they can dispose of it again in the purchase of merchandise. So here, where Europe wasn't ready to have this in any stable form until the 19th century, you have paper money. And of course, the paper money almost naturally has to be printed so that every piece is a replicate of every other's. Now that was then, the word was being brought back by people who went to China.